Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Friday, February the 9th. Welcome to our video commentary. Today we're going to remember something that happened on February the 9th, 1964. It was a night that the Beatles made their first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show here in the United States. It was an amazing evening. According to the statistics, something like 73 million people were watching the show. It's still one of the largest audiences ever to watch an American television show, even taking into account the differences in population. The number of television sets, the percentage of television sets that were tuned in to the Ed Sullivan Show that night, it's still one of the highest, in the top 5, I understand, of the highest rated television shows ever, the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. Of course, the Beatles came, they performed several songs, they were touring the country after that, and they dominated radio, they dominated the charts for several years. They became really the most creative force in music for several years with the songs of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. But I want to talk today about two people who had a lot to do with that first show. One is Ed Sullivan, and the other is Brian Epstein. Ed Sullivan, the host of a show, and Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles. Ed Sullivan is one of the greatest stories of American television. This is a man who had no entertaining talent. He never made a movie. He never recorded a song. He never danced. He was not an artist or an entertainer by any means, but he understood how to put shows. He was a very good businessman, and he surrounded himself with some very good people. So in the early 1950s, he began doing a show on Sunday nights. The show became a highly rated show. Elvis Presley was on the show. So he had a knack for finding talented people and presenting them to the American public every Sunday night. He also understood that the audience included children, included women, included men, and he would always bring different people to the show to satisfy the different segments of the market or the different segments of the audience that he knew were tuning in on a particular evening. The story of Ed Sullivan and the Beatles apparently goes back to the summer or the fall of 1963 when Ed Sullivan and his wife were visiting London and they heard about the Beatles. One story says that they were in a cab and they saw a bunch of girls screaming, rushing to a place to see the Beatles, and he asked the cab driver, "What's going on?" And the cab driver said, "Oh, the Beatles are playing there tonight." And he didn't know anything about the Beatles. Like a lot of people, we didn't know anything about the Beatles in the United States. So he said to his wife, "You know, this is interesting. I bet that if we brought this to the United States, they would scream for the Beatles the same way that they screamed for the Beatles in London." So as soon as he got back, he started the arrangements to connect with the Beatles, and that's where Brian Epstein comes into the picture. Brian Epstein was a man in Liverpool. He was a small businessman, had actually a retail shop in Liverpool. He would sell records and LPs. We don't do that anymore, but there was a time when you had these record stores and you would go in to buy an album or a 45. And he started getting questions from young girls about a group called the Beatles. They would say, "Do you have anything by the Beatles?" And he would say, "Who's that?" So eventually he went down to see them play. He was impressed with their abilities, and then he met with them and said, "Look, I'd like to be your manager." And the Beatles said, "Well, what experience do you have?" And he said, "None. But I'd like to be your manager." So I guess the Beatles were in a situation where they were willing to try out somebody like Brian Epstein. They weren't exactly making a lot of money themselves either. And they got together, and eventually Brian Epstein put him in touch with a record company, and that's where George Martin got into the picture, another important figure in the history of the Beatles. And by October of 1962, they had their first 45. And then in the spring and summer of 63, they had 2 consecutive #1 songs in England. They were doing quite well in England, but they were not known outside of England. So Brian Epstein and the team from the Ed Sullivan Show made the arrangements and brought the Beatles to the United States. And by January, February of 64, the country knew about the Beatles because their song, "I Want to Hold Your Hand," was in first place the night that the Beatles performed on the Ed Sullivan Show. Now, Ed Sullivan died in the mid-70s. His show was on the air for almost 25 years, a very successful show here in the United States. Most of the great musical acts, Elvis, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Bee Gees, all came through the Ed Sullivan Show, and that's how they were introduced to the United States. Brian Epstein ran the Beatles. Unfortunately, he died in in July or August of '67. We're not exactly sure. He died suddenly. There was some allegation that it was an overdose. I really don't know. I would rather not dwell on what I don't know, but he passed away at age 32, unfortunately, leaving the Beatles without a manager, and many people believe or say that that may have been the beginning of the end of the Beatles because they had nobody to really manage them. But it was on this day in 1964 that the efforts of these two men resulted on bringing the Beatles to American television, to the Ed Sullivan Show, a musical night that was phenomenal. Anybody, I don't remember it, but anybody who saw it live says that it was just electric to watch the Beatles on television that night. And the audience was also electrified by their songs that particular evening. So we remember today, February the 9th, 1964, the night that Ed Sullivan introduced the Beatles to the United States, and well, everything changed after that, and it changed for the better as far as the music was concerned. Have a wonderful day, everybody. We have all of these commentaries over at YouTube. We have them on Twitter, and we also have them on my blog. Have a good day. Bye-bye, everybody.